"Sir, you need to leave," the overweight waitress said to the millionaire. Those words, simple and unexpected, were capable of freezing an entire restaurant and forever changing the destiny of one of the most powerful men in America. Nobody understood what was happening. A millionaire about to sign the most important contract of his life, being interrupted by a simple, overweight woman who worked serving tables. But what seemed like senseless audacity would transform into one of the most emotional stories ever lived, one of those that makes us rethink what truly has value. Because sometimes, what seems like an obstacle is exactly what destiny uses to open our eyes. And it was there, in that small restaurant, that Marcus Sullivan would discover that true power isn't in money, but in empathy. It was early evening when the luxury car, black and gleaming, stopped in front of a simple diner on the outskirts of New York City. The contrast was almost comical. A vehicle that cost more than the entire building parked in front of a place where a plate of food barely exceeded $10. From inside, Marcus Sullivan stepped out, a young millionaire just over 30 years old, handsome, athletic, and possessing a confidence that seemed to precede him. The type of man who, when entering a place, made conversations lower in tone and eyes turn. He wore a tailored suit, but with the collar slightly open, like someone who wanted to appear more accessible, a strategy he learned early in business, appear relatable to inspire trust. He was there for a crucial meeting, a strategic move capable of yielding a $200 million deal. But curiously, he didn't seem anxious. On the contrary, there was a strange calm in his expression, as if something inside him already knew that this meeting would be different from everything he had experienced. This wasn't just another business day. It was the beginning of something completely beyond control. The diner, though simple, had a charm of authenticity that sophisticated restaurants could never copy. The walls were covered with old photos of smiling families. The smell of fresh coffee and sweet bread mixed with the sound of pots clanging and cross conversations. It was a type of environment where real life happened, where people didn't wear masks, where every smile came with truth. Marcus, accustomed to meetings in luxurious penthouses and five-star hotels, fell out of place, but in a good way. There was a feeling of life, of humanity, that he hadn't felt in a long time. While waiting for the investors, he discreetly observed the people around. The waiter joking with a child, the elderly woman eating alone and looking out the window, and the young waitress attending tables with hurried steps but a gentle look. It was a simple, almost banal scene, but it made him reflect. There are moments when luxury becomes a gilded cage, and he was beginning to realize that perhaps he had been trapped longer than he imagined. While organizing the meeting documents, Marcus tried to focus on the numbers, but his mind insisted on wandering. That night should be about business, profits, and expansion. However, something inside him whispered that there was more at stake. It was as if the universe were plotting a lesson, something he still couldn't comprehend. He remembered advice his grandfather used to give. Money buys comfort, but doesn't buy meaning. At the time, Marcus laughed. Today, he was beginning to understand. People admired him, envied him, and flattered him, but nobody really knew him. He was a man surrounded by applause, but alone backstage. And it was precisely in that state of inner silence that the unexpected began to approach. Not in the form of an investor, nor an opportunity, but someone who would change everything he believed about value and appearance. A simple woman, with a sincere look and rare courage. A woman who, in just a few seconds, would challenge his power, his vanity, and his very worldview. And it would all begin with a single phrase. "Sir, you need to leave, please." Despite living surrounded by luxury, Marcus had chosen that simple environment on purpose. He wanted to appear more accessible, more human, closer to those about to invest millions in his company. It was an old strategy from the business world. Show yourself as one of us to gain trust. And he mastered that art like few others. The man knew how to adapt to any scenario, from dinners in glass mansions to diners with torn vinyl benches. However, that night, there was something different in the air. He realized that, even disguised in simplicity, he remained the same distant man, the same face framed by success, unable to truly blend in. He looked around and noticed how everyone watched him with curiosity. It wasn't common to see someone like him there, with that shine of someone carrying the world on their shoulders. And it was in that contrast between luxury and humility that the first reality check began. Because sometimes life puts us in unlikely places not to humiliate us, but to teach us. The meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock at night. Marcus's watch showed 7:55 when he adjusted his tie and opened the laptop on the table, reviewing the proposal numbers one last time. The graphs rose like rockets. The projected profits were gigantic, the type of deal that would make his name even more respected in the business columns. And yet, he felt a silent discomfort, as if that deal represented everything he no longer wanted to be. The sound of laughter coming from the kitchen, the sound of the old radio playing a romantic song, and the strong smell of fried onions brought him back to a reality he had forgotten, a reality where money didn't command everything. He watched a humble couple sharing a soda and caught himself thinking, are they happier than me, even with nothing? It was a question he tried to ignore, but one that would haunt him until the end of that night. The waiter brought a glass of water and greeted him with a simple smile, one of those that cost nothing but is worth a lot. Marcus returned it, somewhat awkwardly, and realized that small gesture gave him more peace than any applause at his corporate events. It's curious how, sometimes, sincere kindness can dismantle the most resistant armor. The millionaire leaned back in a chair and looked at the reflection in the window. He saw a man who had everything, but who somehow seemed empty. He didn't know it. But he was about to live one of those emotional stories that destiny reserves for those who most need an awakening. And it would come in the form of a woman who carried within herself the strength and sweetness of souls that never gave up, even when the world made them believe they weren't enough. In the following minutes, destiny would cross their paths, and the phrase she would say would echo in his mind long after the contract was forgotten. While Marcus watched the diner's movement distractedly, on the other side of the counter was Sarah Mitchell, a young woman with a sweet face and quick steps. She had worked there for almost 8 years, serving coffee, cleaning tables, and smiling at customers who, most of the time, didn't even look her in the eyes. Sarah was overweight and carried that like someone carrying the weight of constant judgment. Since childhood, she learned that the world has little patience for those who don't fit the standards. She suffered cruel jokes at school, piercing looks on the streets, and even humiliation from customers who treated her as if she were invisible. But still, every day, she got up before the sun, tied her apron, and moved forward, not out of resignation, but out of love. Love for her father, Robert Mitchell, the man who had taught her to see beauty where no one else did. She didn't have luxury, but she had purpose. And that day, her purpose was simple: work, honor her father, and not let fatigue extinguish the gentle light that still shone within her. Sarah had broad, callous hands, marked by hard work, but also carrying them a delicacy that few perceived. She was the type of person who remembered each customer's usual order, who offered water before they asked, who smiled even when the world seemed to collapse. Behind that shy smile, there was a tired soul, but full of faith. Her co-workers saw her as the good-hearted girl, but she herself had stopped believing in happy endings. In recent years, she had faced difficult days. Her father's illness, overdue bills, the feeling that life was always hanging by a thread. Even so, she didn't victimize herself. On the contrary, she tried to find meaning even in the pain. God doesn't give us burdens without reason, she told herself while cleaning the counter. And it was between one coffee order and another that she noticed the elegant man sitting in the corner table, with an expensive laptop and an impatient look. She didn't know who he was, but felt instinctively that this man didn't belong in that place. And, for some reason, that awakened in her a discomfort she couldn't explain. While watching him from afar, something inside her stirred. Sarah didn't have a habit of judging anyone, but there was something about that man that caused her discomfort. Perhaps the way he looked at everything around with certain silent superiority, perhaps the expensive suit clashing with the simple environment. He seemed like a prince in a kingdom that wasn't his. And, deep down, she feared that his presence there meant trouble. She didn't know he was a millionaire about to close a gigantic deal. For her, he was just a stranger occupying a table he shouldn't. And this detail, which seemed trivial, carried enormous importance. because that table, in particular, was her father's, Robert Mitchell, a simple, sick man, but full of stories. A man who never missed his sacred Thursdays. Sarah took a deep breath, dried her hands on the apron, and decided to do what she thought was right. She walked toward him, feeling her heart race. And, without imagining the impact of her words, she would say the phrase that would change everything. "Sir, you need to leave, please." Sarah took a deep breath before approaching. Her sweaty hands betrayed the nervousness, and her heart beat so fast she could almost hear it above the restaurant's bustle. Each step seemed like a challenge, as if the floor were testing her courage. She wasn't the type of woman who liked confrontation. On the contrary, she always avoided situations that could put her in the spotlight. But there was something bigger there. That elegant man, sitting precisely at that table, awakened in her a feeling of discomfort she couldn't ignore. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just sitting there, with his laptop open and confident look. Still, Sarah felt that an invisible line was being crossed. The table he occupied wasn't just furniture. It was a symbol, a small emotional altar where, every Thursday, her father sat to keep alive the memory of the woman he had loved his entire life. Robert Mitchell suffered from memory lapses, but never forgot that tradition. And now, seeing someone occupying that space, about to transform that night into a business scene, hurt something deep inside her, something she couldn't put into words. With a trembling but firm voice, Sarah approached. The customers around continued their conversations, without noticing the tension forming. She stopped in front of the table, held her apron, and, trying to hide her fear, said with gentleness but conviction, "Sir, you need to leave, please." The word seemed light, but carried an ancestral weight, the type of weight that only those who learn to fight in silence understand. The restaurant, which seconds before echoed with the noise of cutlery and laughter, plunged into an almost sacred silence. Everyone stopped. It was as if time had been suspended. A millionaire, clearly out of context, being confronted by an overweight, simple waitress with a pure but determined look. The contrast was so great that no one dared to intervene. Marcus looked up, surprised. For an instant, he didn't know how to respond. He was used to being obeyed, to giving orders, not receiving them. And suddenly, there was an ordinary woman asking him to leave, with a calm that disarmed any arrogance. "Excuse me, what?" he asked, still incredulous, with a polite smile, like someone trying to understand a misunderstanding. Sarah swallowed, but kept her gaze firm. "This table is reserved. Sir, you need to leave, please," she repeated, this time with even greater serenity. There was something in her voice that didn't sound like arrogance, but dignity, a type of strength that didn't come from position nor from money, but from the soul. Marcus, confused, pulled out his phone and showed the reservation made in his name, trying to explain there was no mistake. But Sarah didn't yield. It was as if her conviction were rooted in something that went beyond a restaurant's rules. And what few would understand in that moment was that this simple act, a humble woman asking a powerful man to stand up, represented more than an argument about a table. It was a meeting of worlds. On one side, power that was always heard. On the other, courage that was always silenced. And it was there in the middle of that clash that the story truly began. Because when a simple truth imposes itself before a giant ego, transformation is always born. Marcus frowned, trying to maintain composure. He wasn't used to being questioned, much less by someone who, in the world's eyes, represented no power whatsoever. The way Sarah looked at him, without arrogance, but also without fear, disarmed him in a strange way. There was dignity in that woman that intrigued him deeply. He looked again at the phone screen, the reservation confirmation, and then at her serene face, as if trying to decipher what was really happening. "Miss, this table was reserved a week ago," he said, trying to sound gentle, but without hiding the tone of authority. Sarah took a deep breath, dried her hands on the apron, and responded, "I know, sir, but this table can't be used today. It belongs to my father." The silence that followed seemed heavier than any argument. People at other tables looked at each other, curious, trying to understand why a simple waitress was confronting such an influential man. And For the first time that night, Marcus realized that perhaps there was something more important happening than a simple business meeting. Sarah lowered her gaze for a moment, like someone seeking strength somewhere within, and then continued, with a voice mixing respect and firmness. For 22 years, every Thursday, my father sits at this table to have dinner and remember my mother, who's gone. This is his way of staying close to her. Understand? It's our ritual, our sacred moment. Those words hit Marcus like an invisible punch. He, who lived amid luxurious dinners and impersonal meetings, had never stopped to think about the value of a simple ritual of love. For him, time was a resource, something to optimize. For her, time was memory, affection, eternity. And that was exactly what he didn't understand, that certain traditions aren't written in contracts, but in the heart. Sarah, though embarrassed by the situation, kept her gaze firm. She didn't speak with anger. She spoke with purpose. And there was something profoundly human in the way she defended that space, as if, by protecting that table, she were protecting the most precious memories of her own life. Marcus was silent for a few seconds, observing her. The air in the diner seemed denser, as if each person there were holding their breath. He wanted to get irritated, wanted to demand she let him stay. After all, he was a customer, and moreover a man used to having everything. But he couldn't. There was an honesty in Sarah that disarmed any argument. And deep down, something inside him began to stir, an old, almost forgotten feeling, empathy. Those simple words about her father made him remember his own, a stern but fair man who had taught him the value of keeping one's word. Some things have no price, son, his father used to say. And now, facing that woman, he finally understood what that meant. The $200 million contract suddenly seemed small, insignificant, and, without realizing it, he was about to make a decision that would change the course of that night and of his own life. A decision that would be born not from logic, but from the heart. The silence that settled in that restaurant was almost physical, heavy, almost palpable. Marcus looked at his watch, trying to remember why he was there. A $200 million contract, investors waiting, a public image to maintain. But the more he observed Sarah, the more that need for control began to dissolve. Time seemed to slow down, and he felt discomfort he couldn't explain. It was as if each of her words had stirred something he had buried long ago, the humanity behind success. He opened the leather folder on the table, took out the documents, and looked at the cold pages full of numbers and clauses, realizing how much his life boiled down to that. "Do you know who you're talking to?" he thought of saying, but swallowed the words. Deep down, something told him that if he said that, he would be confirming the worst about himself. Sarah, still standing, seemed nervous, but didn't back down. She knew she could be fired for that act. And still, she stood firm, because there were things worth more than fear. And, without realizing it, she was giving the millionaire a lesson he would never forget. The sound of the door opening interrupted the moment. An elderly man entered leaning on a wooden cane, his face marked by time, his gaze tired but full of dignity. It was Robert Mitchell, Sarah's father. He approached slowly, without noticing the tension in the air, and smiled upon seeing his daughter. "Sweetheart, is the table ready?" he asked with a trembling but sweet voice. Sarah nodded with teary eyes and responded softly, "Yes, it is, Dad, like always." Marcus watched that scene like someone watching a movie in slow motion. The old man approached, looked at the place he always occupied, and, seeing the stranger sitting there, hesitated. Sarah then explained with gentleness that there had been a misunderstanding, but the gentleman would wait just a few minutes. Marcus, who until then had remained silent, took a deep breath and said, "No, miss, there's no misunderstanding. This table is his." His voice came out lower than he expected, almost emotional, and in that instant something changed inside him, because, for the first time in many years, he chose to yield, and, strangely, that made him feel stronger. Sarah looked at him, surprised, not knowing how to react. Her father, without understanding what was happening, just smiled grateful and sat down. The old man began talking with his daughter about her mother, remembering stories, dates, songs. Marcus, standing a few feet away, watched that simple exchange and felt something tighten in his chest. It was an old tenderness, a nostalgia he no longer recognized. And for the first time, he saw himself completely out of place. Not as the powerful man he used to be, but as someone realizing the emptiness he had built around himself. The executives who were supposed to arrive for dinner began calling, impatient, but Marcus didn't answer. He stayed there, motionless, watching the scene as if wanting to absorb every second. Sarah looked at him again with a mix of distrust and respect. And when he finally left the restaurant, leaving behind the table, the contract, and the hurry, no one imagined that silent gesture would be the beginning of profound transformation, one that, from then on, would connect their destinies in an unexpected and definitive way. Exactly 3 weeks passed since the episode at the diner. Marcus returned to his world of meetings, trips, and commitments, but something in him had changed. The echo of Sarah's words wouldn't leave his head. He continued closing contracts, signing papers, being praised in business magazines, but there was a new discomfort, as if all that had lost its shine. Sometimes at night, for no apparent reason, he remembered her look. It wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about the courage, the simplicity, and the love she showed for that fragile father. He, who always believed power came from control, began to realize that perhaps true power was in vulnerability. For days, he tried to convince himself that meeting had been chance, an insignificant interference. But he couldn't. And when he learned that Robert Mitchell had passed away a few days later, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Genuine sadness. A human, raw feeling that no bank account could ease. It was then that he made an impulsive decision, one that would change the course of the story once more. It was late afternoon when Marcus returned to the same diner, now with a melancholic air. The movement was less, the sound of conversation seemed distant, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the environment. He looked around, and for a moment thought she wouldn't be there. But then suddenly, he saw Sarah coming out of the kitchen with a tired face and swollen eyes. She saw him too, and time seemed to stop for an instant. There was no anger in her look, but there was a silent pain, the pain of someone who had just lost everything they had. Marcus approached slowly, not knowing what to say. "I'm sorry about your father," he murmured, and it was the first time in years those words came out of his mouth with sincerity. Sarah just nodded, trying to hold back tears. The silence between them was heavy, but somehow also comforting. It was as if both knew they didn't need to fill that void with words. He offered to help her, but she refused with delicacy. "My father taught me not to owe anything to anyone," she said, wiping her hands on the apron. But before he left, she added something that disarmed him. "Thank you for giving him that table that day. He died in peace because of that." Marcus stood there without reaction. He didn't know how to respond. That phrase echoed inside him like silent thunder. He died in peace because of that. No one had ever said anything like that to him. He realized in that instant that the small gesture of yielding a table had transformed into something much bigger. It had been a gift, a last happy memory for a man who only wanted to say goodbye to the woman he loved. And that thought devastated him inside. For the first time, Marcus felt ashamed of his own success, ashamed of everything he had become. Before leaving, he discreetly placed an envelope under the table. Inside, there was a short letter and an amount of money enough so Sarah wouldn't have to work for a while. But when she found it, a few hours later, she tore the envelope, left the money right there, and kept only the letter, because deep down, what mattered wasn't the value. It was the gesture. And on that paper, written by hand, there was only one phrase: "I wish I had known your father before. I think he would have taught me more about life than any company I've ever had." After that day at the diner, Marcus couldn't continue his life as before. That simple woman had opened a wound he didn't even know existed. The empire he had built suddenly seemed fragile and purposeless. The sound of toasted gala dinners, the lights of luxurious parties, the bustle of million-dollar meetings, everything lost meaning. He began to question himself. What good is being admired if nobody truly knows me? It was then that he decided to do something unthinkable for someone in his position. He canceled all commitments indefinitely and began visiting shelters, public hospitals, and small communities. He wanted to understand where the strength came from in people who, even with nothing, still smiled. In one of those visits, he met a nurse who recognized him from a TV report and asked, "Is it true you helped that girl's father from the diner?" He smiled discreetly and responded, "I didn't help enough." It was the first time he admitted that money alone doesn't save anyone. It only amplifies who you are. And he wanted to be better. Months later, Marcus surprised the market by announcing the creation of the Robert and Margaret Foundation in honor of Sarah's parents. The idea was simple but powerful. Finance medical treatments for elderly people with terminal illnesses and offer psychological support to families. The project was born from a small gesture, but carried a gigantic force. And when invited to speak about it at a charity event, Marcus did something few expected. He told the story of the waitress who confronted him over a table. Without naming names, he described how that moment of humility had become the turning point of his life. "That day," he said, "I learned that there are people who carry more nobility in a dirty apron than many in expensive suits." The audience fell silent. Some cried, others applauded. But no one left that hall being the same. The speech went viral on social media, and many wanted to know who the woman behind that story was. Marcus, however, maintained her anonymity. He didn't want to transform what was pure into spectacle. It was then that destiny, as it tends to do with those who act from the heart, decided to cross their paths again. A year later, during an inauguration of a new wing of the foundation, Marcus walked through hallways full of flowers and lights, greeting doctors and volunteers. When he heard a voice he would recognize anywhere. "Mr. Sullivan?" He turned and saw Sarah, more confident, with loose hair and a serene look. She was there as a volunteer social worker. The reunion was silent, almost sacred. She didn't say anything for a few seconds, just smiled with the delicacy of someone who knows the value of gratitude. "My father would have been proud," she murmured. Marcus took a deep breath, and in that instant, something inside him completed itself. There was no more debt, no guilt, only respect and admiration, and perhaps something deeper, something that not even time would be able to erase. It was in that moment he realized that some real stories don't need a happy ending. They just need to exist to remind the world that there's still hope, even in the most unlikely places. After the inauguration of the foundation wing, Marcus began to get more closely involved with the projects that had emerged from that small gesture at the diner. Each hospital visit, each meeting with doctors, each encounter with volunteers was a living reminder that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in impact. And discreetly, he began to accompany Sarah in her activities, offering support so she could dedicate herself to work without worrying about daily sustenance. For him, it wasn't charity, but recognition of the strength of that woman who, without realizing it, had awakened in him something that seemed to sleep for a long time. He learned to listen more, to yield space, to value small details, like the sincere smile of someone being heard. And with each gesture, he perceived how his presence could be more than a financial investment. It could be human transformation. Sarah, for her part, began to perceive subtle changes in the man who before seemed distant and inaccessible. Marcus didn't treat her as someone inferior, nor as an exception to the rule. He treated her with genuine respect, valuing her knowledge, her courage, and the way she carried her father's story. She was still overweight, still carried marks of rejection and cruel looks, but her self-esteem began to flourish organically, not by external influence, but by the recognition of someone who saw in her what she had always known, nobility, strength, and generosity. Little by little, conversations between them became more frequent, not about money, but about life, choices, memories, and dreams. Each gesture of care he demonstrated seemed to transform not only her perception of herself, but also his perception of the world. It was as if, through Sarah, Marcus were learning to live again, to truly feel, and to recognize that the most important people in life aren't always those who occupy the top of the social pyramid. Over time, Marcus became not just a discreet benefactor, but a true ally in Sarah's life and in everyone who depended on the foundation. He accompanied medical appointments, arranged transportation, helped with the logistics of social projects, always humbly, without ostentation. But above all, he began to realize that his heart, once closed and distant, was being touched by feelings that money couldn't buy. He watched Sarah, now confident and sure of herself, smiling at the elderly people she served, and felt a deep affection growing inside, not for the body, but for the courage, kindness, and principles she carried. The connection between the two strengthened without hurry, as if each encounter were a lesson about patience, true love, and respect. Marcus finally understood that he had found something that not all power or fortune could offer him. The feeling that someone's heart could, in fact, align with his. And while walking beside Sarah through illuminated corridors, he felt that life, at times, chooses its heroes silently, discreetly, and rewards them in the most unexpected way possible. As months passed, the coexistence between Marcus and Sarah became natural, almost inevitable. It was no longer just about financial support or foundation care. It was about sharing moments, understanding silences, perceiving details that few would notice. Marcus began to notice the way Sarah spoke, the delicacy with which she touched each person she helped, the way the world seemed to open around her without her needing to beg for attention. He, accustomed to measuring everything with numbers and strategies, discovered that some values can only be felt: empathy, generosity, and the courage of those who face the world daily. Each gesture of hers touched him deeply, and he realized he hadn't fallen in love with appearance, status, or social convention, but with the soul of someone who carried pure nobility, even when no one else saw it. Marcus understood that true love isn't born from the physical, but from character, kindness, and the capacity to transform lives. Sarah, for her part, felt something new flourishing within. She who for years had been ignored, judged, and devalued for being overweight, now saw herself recognized and admired not for a superficial detail, but for her essence. Each word from Marcus, each silent gesture of care, reinforced a value she had always known she had, but that society had tried to erase. There was no hurry, no need for grandiose decorations. There was presence, attention, and respect. They shared long conversations, discreet laughter, silent exchanges of glances that conveyed more than any speech. It was a type of connection that can't be bought, forced, or planned. It simply happens, as if destiny had waited all this time to unite two compatible souls. And, over time, what was admiration transformed into affection, and affection transformed into love. That love that doesn't need fanfare, but is felt in every gesture, every smile, and every small daily care. Finally, after so many trials, losses, and discoveries, Marcus and Sarah found their harmony. He, who had been a young millionaire concerned only with contracts and investments. She, who had faced contempt and judgment her entire life. Together, they built a world where empathy and love were more valuable than any fortune. The millionaire and the overweight woman proved, day after day, that true love is born with a heart is more beautiful than the body, and that life rewards those who value people's essence above appearances. Their hands intertwined, not by convention, but by choice. Their gazes met, and in that silent encounter was contained the entire story. Sarah's courage, Marcus's transformation, and proof that, sometimes, life's greatest treasures aren't in vaults, but in the hearts of those who dare to love without limits. Their story became eternal, not because the world applauded, but because both had learned that true love is built on kindness, patience, and deep respect for one another. This story reminds us that small actions can transform entire lives. A gesture of courage, an act of empathy, a decision made with love and respect can change destinies. How many times have you stopped acting out of fear or thinking your impact would be irrelevant? Marcus and Sarah show that true power isn't in money, but in how we value character, kindness, and courage. So I ask you, what can you do today to transform someone's life or your own? Don't wait for the perfect moment. Look beyond appearances and recognize the value of those around you. If you felt inspired, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who needs to believe there's still hope. Because small actions can change the world, one heart at a time.